Okay, so let me go over a couple of things that you should be careful about and knowledgeable about coming up. So this week, of course, is our last. This lesson is our last note. So you will have an exam over all the notes from January 1st all the way up to today. So you want to study your notes this week. You want to get really good at them. You want to study them so that you can recall, and I'm going to give you some specifics, areas to study for toward the end of this session. But right now, let's mention a couple things coming up. First thing is that on May 19th, that's a Tuesday, okay, coming up, that morning from 9 a.m. to noon, I will be at Huffington, and I will be at Building D, and we'll be passing out to you your final exam. Okay, so you need to come by in your car, drive up, and I'll hand you your exam. You will hand me your folder of homework, and that folder should include your research paper. So your research paper should have been finished on the 14th. Of course, you could even still now be working on it if you needed to, but you should have it completed and in that folder on the 19th. So I'll be collecting that. Now, I will also return to you some of your assignments, and so you'll go home and you will take the exam. Okay, so you're going to, before you do though, study. You can study for a number of days, so study your notes. You have your notebook, and then you're going to take the exam, and you should take the exam sometime around the 21st to the 25th. So the exam should be taken the 21st through the 25th, sometime in there. And then on the 26th, which is the next Tuesday, you're going to bring your completed exam and bring it back to Huffington, and you're going to hand it off to me. And it should be stapled, and your parent should have a signature on it, because your parent needs to be there present while you take the exam and make sure and write their name down that they know that you did not receive any help on it. You did not look in your textbook. You did not look in your notes. You received no help while you were taking the test. Okay, so then it should be stapled. Your parent's going to sign it, and you're going to bring it back on the 26th. Now, in addition, on the 26th, you're going to drop off your notebook. So your notebook is going to be left with me on the 26th. And in addition, any other homework that you've completed, so your homework folder should be left. So those three things, your exam, the notebook, and the homework folder, will be dropped off on the 26th. Now, what I will do is I will hand back to you graded homework and your research paper. Your research paper should be finished there on the 26th, okay? And I can pass that back to you. Now, the following Tuesday, June 2nd, which is also just a week later, there's the last one of our pickup drop-off days. Okay, this is the last day for any pickup and drop-off. And on that day, you will come by to pick up your notebook. Now, the other thing that you will do is you will drop off your textbook. And I guess you could drop off your textbook on the 26th. That would be okay to do it on the 26th if you want. But by the 2nd, and you might need that textbook if you've got any kind of homework left that you still need to get in. But you can drop off that textbook on the 2nd of June. Okay, so that's coming up. Those are things that you're going to need to do. Right now, we do have planned that on 6/8, there is our end of the year ceremony. And so you will hear more about that end of the year ceremony, but you can plan on that at this point. Now, we're not quite sure where we're going to be with a crowd being able to be and handing awards out, but we'll just have to see where that's going to be. We do have a dessert planned. It's cake, pies, and cookies, and so a dessert that night, and then the ceremony. So we'll let you know more about that. Let's go ahead for right now, and let's review a few things as we ask you now to get your notes, or continue in your notes. We want to review a couple things that are important. One is we want to review the Roman house. And we have given you a handout with the Roman and Greek house. And you should get that handout. I gave it to you about 3 weeks ago. And we're going to make a sketch of that house right now. And this is a typical Roman house. The street is just outside the front door. Here's the street. And it had a little inset called a vestibulum. And so a person would step off the street into the vestibulum and knock on the door. So you need to be able to identify these parts of the Roman house. This is important. So they had a vestibulum. Then they walked in and they had a larger room which had an open skylight. And it's open ceiling, I should say. And this was called the atrium. The atrium is sort of an open, airy area, and so there's a lot of fresh air, and they'd aired the house out. And of course, little rooms off to the sides, off the atrium. Then in the middle of the atrium was a place where, as it rained, and it didn't rain very much in Italy, it was kind of like an Albuquerque climate, and they call it a Mediterranean climate. But they had this section in the middle of the atrium. It was like a little depressed area called an impluvium. An impluvium basically was a little indoor pool. Okay, so impluvium, and the impluvium caught the drainage of the water and stuff that came through the opening there in the roof. Now, as they walked further back into the house, there was another opening, generally in a home, and this was called the peristylium. Peristylium. And you can see very clearly that peristylium has this idea of the peristyle. If you remember on the Greek and the Roman temples, the peristyle was that area around the temple up on the top level where you could walk around on that upper level of the temple. Peri means around, okay? So it was the peristyle. And this was ringed with columns that held up the roof. So you had a number of columns. So you're looking down, obviously. We're in a bird's eye view of the house. And the columns surrounded the peristyle, okay? And those are really the main areas that you need to remember from the Roman house. Now, as we want to review as well, the cathedral, because now as we've left Rome last week, and I gave you much information on the cathedral. And so the cathedral had a plan that was very interesting. As you look, again, a bird's eye view, the cathedral had a rounded end to it, and then it had two wings that extended off the main body of the church. The main body was where the people sat, and it gives this whole look of a cross. I haven't drawn it very symmetrically. Sorry about that. So I would probably amend it a little bit, make this a little bit longer. But this end, this body part is where the chairs or the pews would be set up, and this was the nave of the church. This is the main seating area. So these pews were set up here. So I'm going to label it the nave. I'd like you to do that in your notes right now. Of course, you can look at your diagram, but I'd like you to outline it right now in your notes. Remember, anything that goes on this page that you see, be sure those go in your notes. And partly, it's to get you so that you can do better drawings and you learn it better. So if you can make sketches as you study, if you can make lists of terms and check which terms that you know, and then make a smaller list of the terms you didn't know, and then kind of whittle that down and review. That's a good way of studying. Well, this is another good way, is making a diagram of the parts of the cathedral. Okay, and so in these sections that go across the middle of the church, these would also provide seating, and these were called transepts. So it has a transept, okay, and it goes across, providing extra seating. But it also gives the church from from above a cross-shaped. We call that cruciform. I don't know why this is doing that, but let me see if I can. There you go, cruciform. So it's cruciform or shape. So cruciform. We also have crucifix, which is, crucifix is the cross-shaped execution that Jesus went through. So it's a cruciform shape. Now this upper part here has, in this section, some rows where the choir would sit. And this section is often called the choir. And so the choir would sit in robes. And then there was a barrier that was across. It was usually an iron, like a wrought iron veil. You remember how the temple had a veil before the priest could go and minister into the Holy of Holies? Well, back here, there was the altar. And this was where the priests would stand and do the service. And so let's label altar. And then this circular area is called the apse. Okay? And that area was only where the priests could go. They could go behind this screen. And so this was usually like wrought iron, this big screen that went across. And it was marking kind of a separation from the very holiest place of the church and the rest of the people. And this was during the Middle Ages, and this was part of the ceremony and symbolism that only priests could go through this barrier and minister back here with the altar. So this barrier is called an altar screen. I think you'll see that in some of the books. It's also known as an altar or an iron veil, but I think altar screen is probably your best description of that veil, basically, that only the high priest, only the priest could go back behind there, and he could perform communion, or as they call it, Mass in the Catholic Church. So the nave, the transepts, you have the choir section, the apse section, which is the rounded area back there, and that's where the altar is located behind the altar screen. So a little bit of review there. So now in the great cathedrals, as you saw, last week we gave you a diagram of the different features of the cathedral, and of course the cathedral had the apse. I'm going to make a list of these items. So the apse, the Clerestory, or the Clerestory, Clerestory. Now those were the high windows that let light in. And of course windows seal the building off from the elements like rain and snow and wind, but they don't weigh as much as the stone does. So there was an advantage to putting big windows in the cathedral, because the stone walls would not weigh as much, and they would use arches to take the weight of the walls and transfer it to the side, and they could put a window there. And of course that was a Roman idea. The Romans invented the arch. They also had vaults, and vaults had to do with the ceiling. So it was a vaulted ceiling, meaning it had supports that ran from the ground all the way up the walls and then reached over to the middle of the top of the roof, and it took the weight of the roof and transferred the weight to these vaults, and then to the walls, and then down the walls. Now that works out really well, because then they can get a big span across. So they got this big, huge span here across the nave, and you could have this airy, light feeling as you went into a cathedral, and it makes you your look is directed upwards. Some of you have been in cathedrals. We go into the National Cathedral when we go to Washington, D.C. on the junior-senior trip every 2 years, and it's invariably one of the best stops. People remember it so well because they're just almost kind of lifted up. It's so high and such a light, airy feeling that the idea was it was to direct your glance heavenward. So the vault accomplishes that big middle spanse, so there doesn't have to be any big support piers or pillars through the middle of the church. The vaults carry the weight of the ceiling over to the walls on each side. Now, one of the problems with the cathedrals, because they have all that weight over onto the walls will tend to bow outward and collapse, but collapse outward. Instead of collapse inward, they'll bulge outward and collapse that way. So what they did is they put big buttresses. They put these big, heavy buttress piers, they call them, big, heavy masonry things outside, like big columns, outside the church itself. And then with flying buttresses, they built supports. And so the transfer of the walls are pushing outward. Well, that's transferred now over to the buttress. So this is a buttress, these big heavy towers. And they had buttresses all the way around the cathedral. And so on every wall outside of the building. And then they had these flying buttresses, these like little supports that extended from the buttress over to the wall. So these were called flying buttresses. These would be the small ones. And so you have that in your drawing, okay? Flying buttress. Now, obviously, since we're spending time last week on this, and now we're spending time reviewing it, high probability, in fact, I would say certainty, that this is going to be on the exam. So This is really good to get all of these terms in line. Now sometimes they would also put a huge circular window, and this was called a rose window. So it's a big circular window, stained glass, and the window would allow lots of filtered light in. And so these would be some of the important features of the cathedral. But you should really study that diagram I gave you last week. It's a handout, and on it you underlined all the terms that you should know. So study that, make sure it makes sense. Now, with the Romans, the Roman architecture really had four key advances, or four key achievements of the Romans in architecture. And let's just review that real quick. This is going to be on your exam as well, so please note that. Architecture. Number one, the Romans came up with concrete. They were the first people that had concrete, which is cement with rock mixed in it, and they could pour concrete into forms, and they could make all kinds of interesting shapes. They could do a dome over a building, and it was just really, really versatile. They also came up with the arch. And so the Roman arch was made so that they could use an arch, okay, in place of this big heavy wall. Okay, so by putting an arch, the wall above it would transfer down, and then it would transfer to the sides and to the side. So you could take and you were eliminating all of this stonework inside the arch. So the whole wall would be much lighter. So the arch helped them achieve higher walls that were lighter walls. So they could now go, I think it was up to like 7 stories. I think they could go 7. Previous to the arch, it would start crumbling with the 3rd floor. 3rd floor would start the bottom floor crumbling. Okay, a third one is the vault. Now, what is a vault? Well, a vault is where you have a building and you cover it with a series of arches. And you'd say the building is vaulted. So here would be a vaulted building, the windows on the side. And a vault is this big arch, and then it's continued arches all along the length of the building. And this particular, when it extends like that, this is called a barrel vault, because it's real long. A barrel vault. Okay, so they came up with the idea of the vault, which is really an arch extended, isn't it? It's just like putting an arch on top of a building and extending it. It's like a rounded top, okay, a rounded roof. And then they altered the vault. Of course, you can see the vault is altered a bit with the barrel vault, but another alteration that they invented was the dome. Of course, a dome, like on the Pantheon in Rome, this big building that was built for all the gods, the dome is just a huge, arch, but it's an arch and another arch and another arch and another arch and another arch, and it just extends all the way around the building. Now, the Pantheon is huge. It's 143 feet around with openings, and it was a place where all the gods of the empire would be placed on display. And so it also had a big hole up here in the top of the dome, and this was called an oculus. Oculus is the word for eye in Greek. Okay, and so this was where God was supposedly looking down. This was God's eye, and he's looking down on his inside his building, a building for all the gods. So that's the Pantheon. Pan means all, and theos is gods. So all the gods would be in this building. So the Romans, allowed people to keep their gods when they conquered them, except they required everyone would worship Caesar as a god. Okay, so let's continue a little bit more. And now we're going to enter in, let's do a little more review and go through the Roman emperors that you'll need to know. Well, the first Roman emperor is Augustus Caesar, and he was sometimes known as Octavius or Octavian. Once he died, there were the 4 Julio-Claudian emperors, okay? So I'm going to say the Julio-Claudian emperors. These are in your notes, so let's just review them. Tiberius, and then there was Caligula, and then there was Claudius, and Nero. And we've explained what each one of those emperors is noted for. So I would know this. I would know all of these emperors in order, and I would know something that each one is known for. Okay, now following the 4 Julio-Claudian emperors, we get to the Flavian emperors. And there's 3 of those guys, the Flavian emperors. And so the one who follows Nero is the first emperor who was ever actually chosen, and that is Vespasian. He was actually recruited, not chosen, but he was recruited. They liked him. He was from Spain. He was the first non-Roman, and he was kind of nurtured and mentored to be a emperor. Now, he had 2 sons. The first one was Titus, and Titus is the general that went in and wiped out Jerusalem, tore the temple down in 70 A.D. And then when Titus died, Domitian became emperor, and that's his younger son. So there's 3 of these Flavian emperors. And then there's 5 good emperors. And we talked about these 5 good guys. They were not all together good, but they were a cut above most of the emperors. And so they're known as 5 good emperors. The first one is Nerva. And Nerva is, of course, mentioned in your textbook. You can read about the 5 good emperors. Trajan, who was a general who had built Trajan's wall. He had extended the emperor to the greatest extent. Hadrian built Hadrian's wall, and that was in England. Then we had Antonius Pius, who was a very good emperor in a lot of ways, and Marcus Aurelius. So those are the emperors that you need to remember. There's 5 here with Augustus Caesar, 4 Julio-Claudian emperors, 3 Flavian emperors, and then 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius, Pius, and Marcus Aurelius.